Hey everyone, it's Mexie and it's been a while, but today we're doing a collab with Doug from the Zero Books YouTube channel. So if you haven't checked out Zero Books, do so. They also publish some really rad anti-capitalist literature. So I've talked about capitalism and the environment quite a few times now, so I'll link my other videos below. I actually have an entire playlist called The Environment, but today I wanted to focus specifically on water, and this is actually a recommendation from Eddie Alden, so shout out Eddie. But I thought this was a good topic because they've been saying for decades now that water is the resource that we're all going to be fighting each other over in the 21st century, and water, like food, is an essential for human life. So the danger of allowing this to be viewed as a commodity and not a human right really cannot be overstated. There's about 1.4 billion cubic kilometers of water on Earth, but only 36 million cubic kilometers of that is fresh water, a mere 2.6% of the total. Fresh water is only renewable by rainfall, however, so humans can only rely on 34,000 cubic kilometers of renewable fresh water for human consumption. That means that only 34,000 cubic kilometers can be harvested without depleting finite water resources. The hydrological cycle circulates water from the atmosphere to the earth and back. Water evaporates from the oceans and water systems of the continents and goes up into the atmosphere to form clouds. When the clouds cool, rain is formed and falls to the Earth's surface and soaks into the ground where it becomes groundwater. This underground water comes back to the surface in the form of source points for rivers and streams. This surface water and ocean water then evaporates again, starting the cycle anew. Most of the Earth's fresh water, however, is stored underground. The volume of groundwater is 60 times greater than the volume of surface water. Underground reservoirs, called aquifers, are relatively stable because they're secured in bodies of rock. Many of them are closed systems, meaning that the water stored down there does not circulate through the water cycle I just described. Wells that tap into aquifers therefore access secure stores of water, but to be useful over time, these need to be replenished with new water at approximately the same rate as the rate of extraction. Around the world, however, we're extracting groundwater at rapid rates to make up for declining supplies of surface water, and this is not being replenished. Per capita, water consumption is exploding. Global water consumption is doubling every 20 years, more than twice the rate of population growth. Technology and sanitation systems, particularly in the West, have allowed people to use way more water than they need. In many of my travels or just living different places around the world, we would often have a set amount of water for the day that we would have to ration. And I would always just think that people would be appalled if they saw the amount of water that we just threw away in the West every day. So where is it all going? Many of the world's leading industries today are super water intensive. It takes 400,000 liters to make one single car. In the US alone, the computer industry uses over 1,500 billion liters of deionized freshwater and produces over 300 billion liters of wastewater each year. Originally thought to be a clean industry, Silicon Valley has more EPA toxic Superfund sites than any other area in the US and hundreds of groundwater contamination sites. And you knew I was going to mention it, animal agriculture is one of the biggest culprits when it comes to water usage and contamination. Nearly half of all water used in the US goes to raising animals for food. It takes more than 2,400 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of meat versus 1 pound of wheat taking only 25 gallons. You could save more water by not eating 1 pound of meat than you would by not taking a shower for 6 months. And a vegan diet requires 300 gallons of water per day versus a meat-eating diet which requires 4,000 gallons per day. Check out my podcast on factory farms and environmental racism to learn more about how animal agriculture is the #1 contaminant of our waterways. But E. coli, anyone? There was a huge E. coli disaster that I remember in a small town in Walkerton in Ontario in the year 2000. The town had a population of only 5,000 at the time. 7 people died as a result of the contamination and 2,300 people fell sick. Cattle manure had washed into the town well after heavy rains, and the Conservative premier at the time, Mike Harris, following a classic neoliberal program of deregulation, cuts to spending, and privatization, removed E. coli testing from their water surveillance program and then shut down the program altogether. Because you see, kids, government regulation merely interferes with the unparalleled efficiency of the free market. The oil and fracking industries are obviously major culprits. The tar sands here in Canada use an ungodly amount of water to turn the dirty tar sands into heavy bitumen in a process that emits 17 to 20% more greenhouse gases than the process to pump conventional oil. The water used comes out in toxic tailing ponds, covering about 251 square kilometers and holding enough water waste to fill more than 500,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools, or 304 billion gallons. There are people whose job it is to sit around and shoot at wildlife and birds that try to land in the ponds because they are that toxic. Same with fracking. It produces water that is so toxic that it needs to be prevented from re-entering the water cycle. So we're actually removing precious fresh water from the cycle and turning it into toxic sludge that we need to protect all other wildlife from. Efficiency. All too often, this is also at the expense of Indigenous nations whose traditional territories are around these horrible toxic wastelands. I will do another video on Fort Chipewyan and Grassy Narrows in Canada because their stories are just harrowing, but obviously this really tramples Indigenous rights and removes any possibility of self-determination. Pipelines are also threatening Indigenous rights, self-determination, and health all across the continent, from Standing Rock to now in Canada, the Trans Mountain Kinder Morgan pipeline, which Trudeau has just bought out himself. So thanks, Trudeau. And all of this, capitalist growth, animal agriculture, oil and gas and fracking, all of this contributes to climate change, which is severely disrupting our water cycles. So we talked about the water cycle and how water has to evaporate and then come down again and go through the whole thing. But increasingly, as we pave over so many of our landscapes, water is unable to go back down into the ground and filter properly through the cycle. So we have less water going into the ground and the rivers, etc., and more being just diverted out to sea. So a landlocked country will then receive less rains because the water that's supposed to be staying there within the cycle is simply not. So as climate change advances, certain parts of the globe are desertifying, meaning they're drying up and becoming more like deserts, while other parts of the world are being hammered with more intense and frequent storms causing devastating flooding. I made videos about Hurricanes Katrina, Maria, and Irma and the political economy of these disasters, but there have been many other examples in the US alone in the last decade. Sandy, for example, completely flooded New York, which was a real shock to many. So we have intense droughts and desertification where we need crops, and then on the other hand, we're being ravaged by more intense storms. We have the fresh water that we need to drink being diverted to things like animal agriculture or fracking, etc. We have sea levels rising and sinking entire nations like Tuvalu. We have glaciers like the ones that feed the Ganges River drying up, which will impact hundreds of millions of people. And we have what's remaining being bought up and privatized by mega corporations. And this once again stems from the fact that water is seen as a commodity and not a human right. The World Water Forum in 2000 brought stakeholders from around the world to debate this very concept. Should water be considered a human need or a human right? It was convened and directed by big business lobby organizations like the Global Water Partnership and the World Bank, along with mega corporations like Suez, Vivendi, Nestle, Unilever. Unsurprisingly, they determined that water was indeed a need, so that the private sector, through the free market, would have the right and responsibility to provide this resource on a for-profit basis. So being a need, water has been subjected to the supply and demand forces of the global market and is distributed based around people's ability to pay. So privatizing water creates this kind of sick divide where we have people who are worthy of water and life and people who are not worthy. And this becomes even more sick when you realize that the system produces poverty and produces precarity and populations of people who are superfluous to capital who then cannot pay to access it. Thanks to the Washington Consensus and the IMF and World Bank's reign around the world, many countries are now being forced to sell off their water reserves or privatize their water provisioning in order to get some money to pay back their loans. Privatizing these systems has often resulted in jobs being slashed and water prices going through the roof, creating even more of a divide between the haves and the have-nots in terms of water access. One example of troubling privatization is Nestle buying up water around the Great Lakes in Ontario and Michigan. While Flint continues to drink literal poison, Nestle is pumping hundreds of gallons of water out of the state's reserves. As it stands, Nestle is the largest owner of private water reserves in Michigan. So instead of water being diverted to the residents of Flint as an essential human right, we are handing it over to a private company for dirt cheap so that they can encase it in plastic, because more plastic is what we need on Earth, and then sell it back to us at inflated rates. We also have Pepsi and Cola now who have their own bottled water brands, and they take municipal water actually and treat that through reverse osmosis. So once again, this is like if I turned on my tap and took out some water and then encased it in trash, plastic, and then sold it to you at a much inflated rate than you would pay that if you just had turned on your own tap. That's basically the business model we're working with here. It's highly successful. It's highly, highly successful. And even beyond these brands like Aquafina and Dasani, Coke and Pepsi and all these soft drinks take a lot of water to make as well. And we have situations in the world where people don't have access to actual good, clean drinking water, and they have to drink soft drinks instead of water. Ultimately, I think that because water is so vital to life, it might actually be one resource that wakes people up to the barbarity and unsustainability of submitting this essential resource for life to the rapacious logic of the free market. This was clearly shown in the case of the Bolivia water wars. In keeping with spreading the Chicago Boys' free market ideology globally, in 1998, the World Bank refused to give the Bolivian government a loan to refinance water services in the city of Cochabamba unless the local government sold its public water utility to the private sector and passed on the cost to the consumers. The Bolivian authorities were forced to sell their water utility over to a subsidiary of Bechtel. The World Bank then granted monopolies to private water concessionaires, called for full cost water pricing, pegged the cost of water to the US dollar, and instructed the Bolivian government that the loan monies could not be used to subsidize the poor for water services. After seeing their water rates jacked up by nearly 35%, the people took to the streets by the tens of thousands, shutting down their city for 4 straight days through a series of strikes and blockades in January of 2000. After a week of escalating protests, Bolivian president placed the country under martial law and announced that the government would break its contract with Bechtel. When asked to comment directly on the Bolivian protests, the World Bank director at the time maintained that giving public services away to people leads inevitably to waste, and that countries like Bolivia need to have a proper system of charging for water. The World Bank argued that all water users, including the very poor, should be called to bear the full cost of the water system in its proposed expansion. Protest leader Oscar Oliveira said, "I'd like to meet with Mr. Wolfensohn to educate him on how privatization has been a direct attack on Bolivia's poor. Families with monthly incomes of around $100 have seen their water bills jump to $20 per month, more than they'd spend on food. I'd like to invite Mr. Wolfensohn to come to Cochabamba and see the reality he apparently can't see from his office in Washington, D.C." This was a major and well-known win in the fight for water justice, but there are innumerable other fights going on right now, and things will only get worse as this resource continues to be depleted and as climate change worsens. Karl Polanyi argued that leaving the fate of land and labor to the market would be tantamount to annihilating them. Hopefully, the nature of this resource and the fight for global water justice really starts to make people understand that. Special thanks to my patrons and super special shout out to Julian, Joe Weiss, S30311, and Harry Monroe. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a monthly patron or toss me a donation on PayPal Me. Check out my podcast at veganvanguardpodcast.com. Subscribe and share this video with a friend. Goes a long way, and I'll see you in another video.